Welcome back, AP Psych class. We are looking at the end of Unit 7A. The beginning of Unit 7A on memory was your outline in class where we discussed the models of memory, how things become a memory, the steps or stages that are taken in that process. But obviously, being a human being, you know not everything you've ever committed to memory is still there. So forgetting is an interesting topic to explore. So why does this happen? Why do we forget? Um, know that as we become more advanced as a society, as a culture, this becomes a more fascinating topic for psychologists to study, in that we tend to be bombarded with information. And there's actually a lot of current research being done to discuss whether or not, technology is actually going to lead to a rewiring, if you will, of the human brain. Obviously, not over the course of just a generation, but it'll be curious to see how the effects of not having to have mass amounts of semantic memories in our brain, facts and information, if that can be stored by a computer, will that change our capacity for memory? So information overload is kind of the catalyst for a lot of this research. Daniel Schachter, a psychologist, kind of labeled some of the ways that we forget a very cute way as the seven sins of memory. We have, he divided them up into categories of forgetting, distortion, and intrusion. Um, and so know that, your sins of forgetting would be absent-mindedness, transience, and blocking. Absent-mindedness is probably a result of just not paying attention, and so something's not correctly encoded and stored as a memory. Transience is probably the result of just, not using a memory after a period of time. It tends to decay or go away. And blocking is that horrible feeling of knowing something but being unable to retrieve the memory. Again, all just ways of forgetting as part of his seven sins of memory. The sins of distortion would be misattribution, suggestibility, and bias. Okay, meaning that distortion can occur as a result of any of those. If you are guilty of misattribution, that's confusing the source of the information, right? Swearing that your mother told you this information when in fact it was somebody else that had told you that information. Um, Suggestibility is just the I guess lingering effects of misinformation, right? Unfortunately, you can store misinformation as a memory, and it becomes very real to the individual. And bias is just your own personal beliefs tainting the memory as it was stored. And so your retrieval of an event might be different than the memory your friend has of that same event. And then your sin of intrusion is just persistence, and that's just when bad memory kind of impedes on retrieval or encoding of new memories. And so not being able to get something out of your mind, replaying an event over and over again, could intrude on other memories. All right, so Schachter's seven sins of memory are kind of explained in your reading just by the intro general psych terms, right? Encoding failure, if you don't pay attention to something, it's not going to become a memory in the first place. Okay, and so that's the key. Remember from our outline, we referred to this as effortful processing. Without effortful processing, there's a good chance that things will either not be stored or will be stored incorrectly. Storage decay, remember that's our friend Ebbinghaus. Know that memories are not infallible, and his Ebbinghaus's famous forgetting curve is worth mentioning. In that forgetting is going to drop dramatically in the short run, but then will taper off over time. And so the great example is a foreign language. What you've learned in that foreign language, if not used, will drop dramatically at the end of the school year. But what you remember 3 years from now, being away from Spanish, let's say for 3 years, you'll probably remember that same information 25 years from now. And so the forgetting curve and storage decay are reasons why the spacing effect is the key to retention of information that you need for school or work or whatever. Retrieval failure could be a result of a couple of things. It could be a result of encoding failure or storage decay, or we just aren't given enough cues in order to effectively retrieve the piece of information. Okay, so interference, that's when earlier learning gets in the way of new learning. Okay, that would be called proactive interference. Retroactive interference would be when the new info makes it harder to recall old stuff. Right, and so it's either interference. Just think like a memory, whether it be a new one getting in the way of old stuff or an old one getting in the way of new stuff. It's blocking your retrieval of that information. And then motivated forgetting. Look, people often revise their own histories. Memory has often been described as an unreliable, self-serving historian, in that we like to downplay our faults and upplay our successes. It's human nature, I guess. Okay, so what is some recent research on all of this? Tolving and Sotka did some interesting research concerning forgetting. They presented people with word lists, like types of buildings or geographic features. Some of the people in the research were asked to learn a list and then recall the items. Other people were asked to learn multiple lists before they were allowed to recall the first list that they had learned. And obviously, they found strong evidence there of retroactive interference, right? That first list was there, right? It was the first one that they had learned, and so that just meant that it was there someplace, but because they kept learning new list after new list, that they had a really hard time recalling the stuff that they had learned, at the beginning of the experiment, even though it was there. How do we know it was still there? If the researchers provided the subjects with a retrieval cue, like the category of the word list. Like, can you recall the list on geographic features? Then there were no interference problems. And so the moral of this story is that whenever you are learning something, it's very important to establish as you are learning it some sort of retrieval cue. Those of you that have been to some of our study sessions after school have noticed that that's one of the things I kind of push you on. Can you organize things? Can you categorize these things? Because the more that you manipulate and work with the information and give yourself those sorts of cues, the easier it is to retrieve the information when you go to take the test. The less likely you'll be a victim of interference. Elizabeth Loftus, probably the guru concerning memory and forgetting. Her work is in creation of false memories, or sometimes called the misinformation effect. You read about her in 40 Studies, but one of her great experiments was that she gave a teenager a description of 4 childhood incidences, and the teenager had to write about each one for 5 days straight. Not 5 solid days, but you know what I mean, once a day for 5 days. One scenario that she had given the teenager was actually a fake one that she had created after interviewing the teenager's family members. And after 5 days of writing about getting lost at the mall, this teenager started to remember the event and added details as each day progressed. At the end of those 5 days of research, the teenager actually rated the false memory as more vivid than 2 of the things that had actually happened to him in early childhood. later experiments on this seemed to work on 50% of people that were experimented on would start to rank false memories as more vivid or more real than things that had actually happened to them. Okay, this was pretty important research, considering that before Loftus, we were still dealing with our psychodynamic, our Freudian view of repressed childhood memories and the subconscious or unconscious thought motivating us, even though we weren't aware of it. So her work kind of discredits some of the stuff that had been around for quite some time. Information inflation is going to be the issue of thinking something and then later believing that it actually happened. Okay, so we know from Loftus and her research that it seems like the more imaginative, the more creative an individual is, the more likely they are to inflate what it is they remember about a situation. They can, make things into memories when they never really happened. Source amnesia is just, again, the psychological term for one of the 7 sins of memory that we talked about on our first slide, attributing the wrong source to an event. Maybe there was an actual happening in your past, but you are, attributing it to the wrong person or the wrong time period, and so we have to be careful of those sorts of things. Biologically, what is happening? So for those of you that are, looking at all of these and thinking, okay, that's great, but physically in my brain, why do I remember some things and forget others? You would be fascinated by the research of Lashley and Hebb. They are kind of the founders of all this neuroscience connection to forgetting and memory. What they did is they taught rats some new behaviors and then purposely damaged specific parts of the brains of the rats to see how it affected the rat's ability to do the tasks they just learned. What happened was that they learned something fascinating, that memories of things aren't stored in one specific location, but tend to be distributed through the brain. And so that's where we get the information or the models on our outline in class concerning parallel processing and the fact that, that we can have multiple storage areas for memories. It's not, entirely explained just yet, but this would have been the basis for our PDP theory that we talked about on the outline. Okay, and so their research is really important. What's happening at the cell level in your brain? Formation and storage of memory is probably because of 2 changes at the synaptic gaps between neurons. First, know that stimulation from your environment actually promotes formation of new synapses or new connections between neurons that previously were not, I'm using finger quotes here, connected. And so repeatedly sending signals, practicing with information, actually increases the number of spines or receivers on a cell's dendrite. So you create more connections, but you can also modify the cell to be more apt to receive that message with practice. So physically, you can change your brain. And then we can also talk about LTP, or long-term potentiation, which is going to be altering the functioning of existing synapses. That cells can become trained to receive messages from certain neurons easier than other ones. And so we have a lot to talk about concerning brain chemistry in class, because much of this stuff is not in your textbook. So bring your notes with you and any questions you may have, and I'll see you then. Thanks.